Thank, thank you everyone for coming to this presentation. I'm going to be talking about a metacognitive cafe and how it's a reflective practice for learning. I actually implemented this in my classes after doing some professional development workshops and speaking with Kane a little bit about, what the metacognitive cafe is and how it's really beneficial for students. So some things that I'm going to cover in this shorter presentation is kind of just exploring the structure and kind of the purpose of what a metacognitive cafe is. Um, Hopefully giving you strategies that you can then implement in your own courses, and then just kind of discovering how it can improve our students' self-awareness and also learning strategies. And kind of just the history of it. So Judith Littlejohn and Kane, our very own here. Judith Littlejohn, Director of Online Learning, Genesee Community College, she first implemented kind of the concept in her own history classes, kind of drawing on inspiration from some workshops that she had done, and seen some resources on critical thinking and metacognition. And same thing, Kane, also our director of CELT. He's a professor of economics here at SUNY Oswego. He also adopted and adapted the idea in his own classes. And together, kind of, they collaborated this shared experience and kind of helped refine and promote what's known today as the Metacognitive Cafe. So it is an effective tool for kind of fostering that reflective learning and community building in educational settings. So that's kind of the background of where it came from. And personally, I was able to learn more about the Metacognitive Cafe about when doing some professional development with John and kind of learning more about the background. Also, the Tea for Teaching podcast, it is episode number 2. If you are interested in hearing a little bit more from kind of those creators on the Metacognitive Cafe. So what is Metacognitive Cafe? So it's really an educational strategy that's aimed at helping students kind of reflect on how they learn. You can do this in several ways, low stakes discussions. It could be study strategies or questions that you're giving students that encourage them to think critically about their learning process, and also comprehension of course materials. There's several different ways that you could go about this. Really, these types of discussions promote self-awareness, community building, and improve learning outcomes for fostering a supportive environment where students can share their struggles, their strategies, and their successes. So kind of what is metacognition? So it kind of refers to the process of thinking about one's thinking. So encouraging self-awareness, self-regulation and learning, such as understanding how one learns best, identifying effective strategies, recognizing biases, and really adjusting methods when necessary. So it really is a reflective practice that empowers learners to become more intentional and efficient in their studies. So why reflective practice matters? There's several reasons. Improving learning strategies, for one, students become more aware of those effective and ineffective habits, enabling them to kind of refine their approach to studying. It helps build confidence as well. Sharing experiences and strategies with peers helps students feel less isolated in their own struggles. Encourages transferable skills, reflecting on how they learn kind of equips them with skills they can apply across disciplines, and fostering, critical thinking, analyzing their own assumptions and their preconceived notions, deepening their learning and understanding of course content. And lastly, creating community. Those low stakes assignments or discussions, allow students to connect on personal levels, sharing insights about study environments, time management, coping, or strategies without worrying, about loss of points or things like that because of the low stakes option. So the structure of a metacognitive cafe. So regular discussions, these could be weekly or bi-weekly low stakes discussions that are separate from content focused assignments, or allow students to kind of reflect on their learning of those assignments. Guided prompts, you can use specific targeted questions about their learning process, about what did they already know about the topic, what did they learn that was new, what study strategy maybe worked best for them this week, did anything in the material change their perspective or challenge their assumptions. Student sharing, this is a great place for, like I said, that community building where students are encouraged to share pictures of kind of like where their study spaces are, discussing their struggles, what advice to peers they would give. reflective. And then, of course, kind of in the structure as the instructor, our role is kind of minimal intervention, ensuring student-driven conversations, in this metacognitive cafe. Instructors may offer feedback and encourage when appropriate in that setting, but really we want the students to kind of have the drive in those conversations. So how to implement the Metacognitive Cafe. So how I did this, I actually did it in a graduate level course, which I thought was really great. And you can do this at any level course. It doesn't have to be first year students. It could be seniors. It could be grad level. It's a great way for them to have those reflective practices. So the implementation process. So kind of how I went through the process was defining metacognition. So first I provided a clear definition to what, each discussion prompt was to help familiarize them with the term. I also had kind of an instructional video explaining what the metacognitive cafe was for, and how it was created, those types of things. Start with simple prompts. So I used questions kind of to activate prior knowledge and connect, to new content material and vice versa. And I incorporated tools, such as using Brightspace in our online discussion boards, right in my Brightspace Shell portal, and creating a safe space. So emphasizing, yet these are low stakes, and community building for open sharing with the students, collecting feedback. So I did do kind of some surveys within the class to see mid-course at the end to kind of gather, input from students on the Metacognitive Cafe and kind of the activity's impact to see how it was going, if I needed to also adjust when needed. And then I also integrated resources, so optional videos, research on learning strategies for students, like a metacognitive checklist, those types of things that they could also use as resources within those Brightspace shells. So as you can see here, how I specifically defined it, I had a whole kind of page in my Brightspace along with an instructional video of me talking about the Metacognitive Cafe, but I really explained, that it's a designated space where they can engage in reflective discussions, talked about it's like a casual coffee shop setting, right, where it's a relaxed environment for those meaningful conversations, where they can come together with their peers. So you can do this in a multitude of ways. This was in one of my online classes, so I had, different ways that I could put it in Brightspace, but also, if you're in a face-to-face course, those types of ways, you can have the discussion with them about kind of defining what that is and kind of how they can use that metacognitive cafe in their own classes. So starting with some simple prompts. So some of the prompts that I used, I kind of integrated, application-oriented thinking, that community building, reflective practice. So kind of an icebreaker, little Metacognitive Cafe question, reflecting on their decision to pursue graduate school, what motivated them, how do they envision the knowledge and skills, impacting them in their community, and then sharing one fascinating tidbit. So that kind of helped with the community building of the cafe, having some reflective practice and also application-oriented thinking, where they're really reflecting on their motivations. They can envision, how they will apply their knowledge, deeper thinking about their goals and aspirations, which is kind of a hallmark of metacognition. And that application-oriented thinking is really envisioning their skills to the real world impact, right? What they can do in the future, in their career path, those types of things. Some other prompts that I had used, how can they leverage what they've learned in coursework from this specific module to make meaningful impact in their own community and workspace? What challenges do they anticipate when applying these concepts, and how can they address them? So here, again, reflective practice, the questions asking students to think critically about how their learning connects to real world scenarios, kind of helping them internalize and contextualize that material, focusing on making an impact. It bridges gap between theoretical learning and practical application, which is central to metacognitive thinking. Self-awareness here as well, prompting students to assess their strengths, their values and skills in relation to their community or their workplace, and really encourages a transfer of knowledge too, because the question kind of motivates students to transfer what they've learned to different settings, right? So that's another critical aspect of metacognition. So how I incorporated the tools, I used discussion board right in Brightspace. So I had just created a new forum and I put those right in along with kind of a rubric and the posting dates, those types of things. I have the Metacognitive Cafe in each module of my course. So that's kind of how I've incorporated it into the tools that we use with our learning management systems. Creating a safe space. Actually, to note also with incorporating tools, this could be done in many ways. Also, this was an online class that I did it, but if you were in a face-to-face class, this could be you could do these small prompts, with exit tickets, muddiest points, those types of things too are great ways to kind of implement it in the classroom setting. Creating a safe space. So I really wanted to emphasize that this was low stakes. I wanted to promote open sharing and that reflective practice. So it was very short for the students to do and also not worth a ton of points in the course, right? It was just 3 points, them really having deep, insightful reflection. So that was very clear to the students in the beginning that I wanted it to be a create or an open space for them to reflect and that this wasn't something that's very high stakes for them to worry about in the grand scheme of things. So I then collected feedback. I did a check-in survey. There was tons of different questions. I just kind of took a photo of the first, slide of it. But I collected feedback about the whole course. But then I specifically had some questions about activities that included the Metacognitive Cafe, where students could anonymously take the survey and they could give feedback on what they felt was working, what wasn't working, including specifically some information on the Metacognitive Cafe. So integrating those resources. So like I said, I'm showing you all of the implementation steps that I had done. So I also had added some resources. And those resources, Developing a Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck. It's a TED Talk. Make It Stick. Also talked a little bit about things in the Make It Stick book, which was one that we did for the reading group here at SUNY Oswego, Cornell note-taking system, and also a checklist for metacognition that they could use as well. And I can send this also to all of you so you can have the slides and you can click on these and use these resources as well. So the feedback from the students. So I did kind of have some questions about the aspects of the course most helpful for learning. As you can see here, peer interactions, Metacognitive Cafe, assignments and feedback, recorded lectures, weekly readings and resources. It varied, but the Metacognitive Cafe, you can see here, was very highly regarded in the course, which was really great. So it was the first time I implemented it. So to get that feedback was really encouraging and helpful to note that this was actually helping the students in these reflective practices. So again, going back to kind of the beginning where we're talking about why does it matter? Clearly it does improve learning strategies. It does help build confidence, encourage those transferable skills, foster that critical thinking, and create community because it was highly regarded in my course, so much so as the recorded mini lectures and things like that in the course. So I was really excited to see the feedback from the students and how it was successful. And I've seen it and I've heard it from, other researchers like John Kane, and things that he's done. So it was great to see that it was very successful for myself as well. So I want to open it up for questions. If there is any.
How
On
many
how I
students were in the class that you implemented this in?
I had about 10 students in the class, so it was a graduate level course. So it was a little bit easier to do it for my first time. So I was a little strategic in doing it in a class like this first, so I could see kind of getting the hang of it. I also thought it was good to do it in a class this small, but also at the graduate level because there was a lot of complex, assignments in the course. So I wanted them to really kind of, talk a little bit more about their learning process and how it's working for them and share that with other students. And I think that was really successful for me in this course. So again, you can use it at any level. I think in the past, I know where I learned it from John, I think your economics class was pretty large online, right? And you had the Metacognitive Cafe, so it can be done in large
Up,
classes.
up until the last couple of years, it was generally between 40 and 65
Yep.
students every semester in an online class.
Yep.
And it worked, and it generally was the highest rated thing in the class, that students found it really useful. And one thing that I really appreciated about it, the very first time I tried it and continuing, is that because students were asked to share their learning experiences and the journey, they talk about things like their work life, their day-to-day life, the challenges they're facing, raising children, or the hours they were having at work. That I was using it in a labor class and an introductory economics class, and that often made its way into the content discussions, which were taking place every week as well, because they got to know each other much more deeply, and that built much more of a better sense of connection that showed up in other aspects of the course, which is one of the reasons why I kept doing it. I've been doing it for probably 10 years now, 11 years.
Yeah, so it's great to, implement it and see, like John said, that it was very successful for me as well. And I did see something similar, with my online graduate course because the course in the being a grad student wasn't their full-time job. So, they were talking a lot about what motivated them, and a lot of that had to be was other things, right? And also the time management, those types of things. And I saw a lot of sharing tips and tricks, which were really, helpful for students. So I did see that come out a lot in kind of their prompts, their responses to the prompts.
So not a super in-depth question, but how do you describe to students why it's a cafe?
So I right in the beginning, so I actually explained to them in my kind of intro of what it is. It's like a casual coffee shop setting. So I explained to them in that way it's called a cafe because it's supposed to be a more informal and kind of relaxed environment for those meaningful, conversations. So where they can come together and they can share insights. And one thing I noticed with that was they did take the cafe seriously in that regard because they would do kind of their low stakes prompt, they would respond to it, but I would see them pop in throughout the whole week of, the Metacognitive Cafe was due at a certain time, but they would still pop in and, respond back, and conversations were still carried on, after the prompt, was complete for their low stakes, points. So really they took it as a coffee shop, as a place that they can kind of go and have that little cafe. So that's kind of how I explained it to them, like that casual coffee shop setting. And I did a video in addition to this to kind of explain that to them, and how they can kind of, have their own little water cooler or their place where they can have their own sense of community where, I was there, but they were the conversation drivers in that area. So, and I think that, was a great point, to make to them because then they really take ownership of that kind of cafe in the course. So that's kind of how I explained it to them.
One of my favorite ones was right at the point in the course where students ran into the most problems, where we started using a bit more math or more graphs, where students always were troubled by that. There were lots of support resources, but the topic for that week was, when we first had that sort of issue, was how do you deal with challenging experiences in your class? And it always tied back to that week's material. And just the fact that they were talking about how this is really much more difficult than what we were doing before. And hearing that from each other made them feel much more comfortable about it so that they didn't feel they were as alone in facing the challenge.
Yeah, I really encourage all of you, it's something small that you could implement, even if you did it a few times. I'm putting the slides in the chat for everyone too. But again, I found it very successful. And, I had done some research on it, listening to, the Tea for Teaching podcast. And also John on his YouTube page has kind of an all SUNY presentation that both Judith Littlejohn and he did, on Metacognitive Cafe and how they implemented it. And I thought it was just a great practice to kind of try. And like I said, you can see from the feedback from the students that it was very successful. It was one of the most highly regarded things in the course. And I think based on what their responses in those prompts were, you could really see them thinking and reflecting, about their learning process, which not only is helpful in the course, but outside, moving on to the career level, really thinking about, those practices and how they can apply them and the application of learning in those types of things. Any other questions?
I noticed that on your last slide about what what students thought helped the most. Metacognition Cafe was at the top of the list, but at the very bottom of the list was peer interaction and collaboration.
Yeah.
Was that the nature of the course, or do you think the metacognition kind of took away from that?
So it's interesting because once I did that survey,
Yeah.
because the Metacognitive Cafe really was it was the peer interaction. So I think the way I created it is a great point, Michael. I noticed that after that, I think that it kind of took away from that in the sense that they knew they were doing it in the Metacognitive Cafe, so it was highly regarded. So I think they were wondering, well, what else was the peer, interaction? So it was happening in the Metacognitive Cafe because that was the discussion board for the online class. So what I probably should have done was remove that and just kept, the Metacognitive Cafe because that's where those peer interactions were coming from. Yeah. But it's interesting to see that they didn't make the connection, I guess, that they were having peer interaction in that and they were rating that lower. But they were in the Metacognitive Cafe. So
Good question. A common sort of response I often got from students in feedback was that it was the first time in an online class that they really got to know their peers more deeply, and that helped.
It's 9:51, right? It's
all
29.
right. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
And I put the slides in the chat, so if you would like to use those, you can take those at any time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.